Without further ado, I want to introduce you to these 5 amazing young people. We have today with us Anushka, co-editor of Gen Zine, and Zine magazines are really awesome, so make sure you check them out. Kim, who is a founder of the National Council of Young Leaders and is also with Opportunity Youth United. We also have Alejandro Ortiz, who is a community organizer with American Friends Service Committee in Iowa. I saw a couple folks here from Iowa, so shout out, Alejandro representing y'all. We have Daniel Rosebud with the Great Project coming from Atlanta. Kim, I believe, is coming from Philly. And Anushka, I believe, are you in California area? Yeah. Did I make that up? Yo, you are, okay, yes. And then Lexi James, which I just introduced with the Hopi, youth liaison with the Hopi Foundation. So I actually want to first touch base with Anushka and Kim. So we have Anushka, who is an amazing organizer, Gen Zer, and we have Kim, who's been a national youth advocate, representing us millennials out there. You know, we're still, we're aging a little bit on the youth side, but we're still here, But I think it's great to have a conversation with both of you all to first ask you for your reactions, as a generation of youth here in the United States, what your reflections are on what you saw on January 6th at the state capitol.
I'm happy to go first. I think it was a very painful and surreal day, but also like surrealism is all about perspective. And I remember like sitting down to watch the TV just for a normal day, and all of a sudden, like the insurrection began to unfold. And I was met with a lot of, I don't know if grief is the right word, but shock. And sometimes people will say like, well, why are you so surprised? Like, this is America. Like, of course this is happening. Or when you look at it in comparison to what was happening and like the responses to the Black Lives Matter protests, like, I think it was important for me to like feel that pain and to like sit with it and to want to absorb it happening. As opposed to just being like, okay, well, it's another day in America. Like, it's not. And I think when people trivialize trauma as a nation or like the events that happen in this country, it doesn't help progress. I think sitting with the pain and not forgetting things that happen is crucial to moving forward.
No, thank you. And
thanks, Anushka. Oh, Mother, were you going to say something? Just some of my reflections for January 6th. It is nothing new. It really reminded me of like the Charlottesville stuff. It was really overwhelming. I think the media dumbed it down more than they needed to. When the Black Lives Matters protest came about, everything went black out. You didn't even hear anything about COVID. So I was expecting like that same thing to happen when people are storming the nation's house. It was very disheartening to see all of that as a young adult, as a young organizer who organized individuals to advocate and walk through those doors. I think the part of me, broken a little bit, because I know that we are really hopeful. At the same time, you have some of us who aren't that hopeful, right? And just those days of being able to advocate on Capitol Hill with folks, it gives you a little bit of hope, like we're striving towards some type of change and people are listening, even in a very partisan climate. We try to be as bipartisan as possible. It's really disheartening for the most part. It really hurt me because I have friends and family who are in DC, and just seeing not only my friends and family, but people who we work with too, elected officials, their safety, and just thinking about like, imagine if you worked up there and you thinking it's going to be a normal day at your job, and then like all of this is happening and people are trying to say what's right, what's wrong. At the end of the day, no one deserves to die. If the political process is being done correct, no one deserves to come in and storm and just try to, mislead people that that's not what it was. But it was really disheartening. definitely a smack in a lot of people's face, especially ethnic people, you know, people who come and protest all the time, and no one's storming the Capitol, breaking into stuff, and like no form of discipline at all or respect for others. So it was definitely an overwhelming day, very familiar within the last 4 years. Like, that's what the climate has been just in community, right? People have been uncomfortable a lot, based off of politics, right? Before, it was, everybody was pretty much okay with, if you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, it kind of like, safety got heightened. People didn't really feel comfortable around people who voted for Trump, because it just seemed like it meant way more than just politics, right? Like the values he stood for, like his whole tone, what he's been pushing throughout his administration was really overwhelming, and it shed light to the things that he cares about or the things that he doesn't care about. And I'm just praying everybody is definitely healing or trying to heal from what they've seen, because it was definitely a lot. And I just think that we needed to amplify white supremacy and call it out way better than we did when it was Black Lives Matter. Everyone sent out a message. We did black boxes, but no one's holding anyone accountable for what happened up January 6th. And now with the transition, it's like we're trying to sweep it under the rug and make other things like compete with the issue of what we saw and what was wrong.
Yes, and just building off of what, and Alejandro, Daniel, and Lexi, I will bring you in to respond to what you have heard from Anushka and Kimberly, but I do want to first build off of what Kim said. So, like you said, Kim, we don't want this to be shoved under the rug. And I think that people see the new administration, they see Biden in, and they feel like, okay, Trump is gone, but I think what we saw on January 6th, it wasn't just even Trump's 4 years. It's been a long thing in our history that has been built up and up and up. And, we saw something in Charlottesville, and I feel like they've shoved it under the rug then. And then it only got worse with the situation that we saw on January 6th, right? So I guess my question to both of you in regards to this is, back in, I think I don't remember the year of the Oklahoma City bombing, but when that occurred, that was domestic terrorism. It was not necessarily called domestic terrorism. Then we had 9/11, something that was a huge marker for a lot of our generation, that even though we were younger, we remember that. It was in 1995, yeah. Thank you for that, Irma. But during 9/11, we remember that, and there was the huge launch on the war on terror, right? And now what we see today, it's almost as if there is a debate on, should we call something terrorism? Do we want to fuel the war on terrorism? So I want to hear your thoughts on exactly that term. I think what we saw on January 6th was terrorism, but I kind of just want to talk a little bit more about, what does justice look like in this situation, right? And just kind of your thoughts on what we have been seeing, because I think this was like the peak of the iceberg, and there's so much other things underneath it, that it's such a huge, complex way of a lot of the things that we're experiencing. So what are your thoughts around that conversation regarding terrorism? And also, how do we move forward with healing? Because I don't feel that we're anywhere near closing that gap.
Thoughts that are going through my head contradict each other. The first one is, yes, call it terrorism. Tell it how it is. Make people uncomfortable. Don't beat around the bush. Like, terrorism is about inciting fear within others and trying to make people not feel secure. And so if that's what it is, then that's what it is. But at the same time, terrorism has this connotation in society where we end up becoming fearful of groups of people who we deem as terrorists. And so the way that I'm trying to move forward from the past 4 years is less about hate and more about love and hope. And that's a conversation I've been having with myself, is that I realized, like, I pretty much, Trump was president for my 4 years of college. And so I feel like that is a really pivotal time in a lot of people's lives in general, in being able to like engage with the world. And I'm starting to realize so much of my passion or energy came from a place of hate and fear. And that is not sustainable for an individual, and that is not a sustainable way in stitching back together a society. And so how to actually use hope and love will, I think, be a lesson in itself. And to move forward, I am someone who likes to use words. I don't know. I don't have the answers yet, but I just think whether it's conversation, hopefully patience with other people, but also like really, really making people think. And that goes back to the language of terrorism and using that to describe it is making people feel uncomfortable with the reality, I think, is my first step.
I feel like what you say is really accurate personally, because in history, did you know that the Black Panther Party was considered a terrorist movement? In fact, there was an assassination conducted by the FBI because Black activists were apparently like riling up so much anti-establishment sentiment back in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement that they just decided that they were going to host essentially what was basically a terrorist attack, so to speak, if you look at it as a way of inciting fear. This was meant to keep the Black communities from rising up against white people. Like they were scared of what Black people could do if they were.
Yeah, so who's joining us actually? So I can actually give you a quick credit for your comments. Who commented it? You can comment on the chat, but thank you for that comment. And that's exactly why I was framing it in that way, right? The discussion around the word use of terrorism, because as Sher mentioned on the comments, wary of terrorism as a label, considering it's been weaponized against the Muslim and Brown communities. And that's something that I was alluding to in regards to the war on terror that was really launched during 9/11. And Anushka, I think you captured that very beautifully. I want to give Kim a couple, 45 seconds to react to what she said and anything that you wanted to build, and then we can bring in the rest of the panel moving forward on some of these issues as well.
I just wanted to share a quote because after all that stressful stuff, I had to look back to one of our great scholars, civil rights activists, of course, Martin Luther King, to really like figure this all out. And this is something I highlighted in the Where Do We Go From Here? What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. We need to be in community more. Those folks who are organizing white people, we need to, allow space, but also invite them to the table. It's okay to disagree, but we have to understand that we're all in this society. And there needs to be respect and love for all. And we need to understand what people's definition of love, because maybe that's how they're loving on people is, kind of coming off as hate. And, we need to love up on people a little bit more. It sounds cheesy and tacky, but honestly, like we need to have more check-ins. I know us ethnic people right now, and it's sad that, when it comes to like Black and brown people, indigenous people, that, it's just, that's how it's being. At the end of the day, when it's Black or brown, it's terror. It's some form of terrorism. And at the end of the day, we got to really start to redefine these definitions and these ideas of certain cultures in our spaces.
Yeah, thank you, Kim, for reading that. And you're right on it. And I want to now bring in Alejandro, Daniel, and Lexi first if you want to comment to anything that was first mentioned in the first section of the discussion, but also to really talk about, we're talking about historical context, and we want to let folks know that a lot of these issues that many of you are leaders on in your community have been going on before Trump, they got exacerbated by Trump, even more by the pandemic. But I kind of want you all to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing, on the ground and its impact on the trajectory of what we just experienced over the last 4 years as well. So feel free, any of you, to pick.
I guess, sorry, I would just jump in there. I think what we all said, a lot of that, I mean, that was all, very great. I agree with so much of that. I think what's like really scary here in terms of like the context here in Iowa is that, I know we're not in DC, but we were in DC. Like Iowa was in DC that day. Like our like people in our neighborhoods, like there was a noticeable footprint of folks from Iowa that were storming the Capitol that day, that were at our Capitol because they couldn't make it to that Capitol. We had police officers in the Capitol taking selfies with some of these, I guess, right-wing folks there that were, again, trying to make a statement even here in our state. And these are things that have been, as you mentioned, kind of developing for quite some time. There's been this, this growing movement from, some of these folks that were, our anti-immigrant folks that have such a stronghold in our state politics. Even like they are organized to push legislation in our state legislature, that are organized to hold these types of rallies and so on, and that's something that essentially we we've been to some extent, as we've discussed, surprised, but also not surprised. It's just been like, as you were saying, the leadership that hasn't responded in a way that truly acknowledges what's been going on and what's going on and where we are right now. And what one of the biggest fears I have now is that the response is going to be escalated in a completely the wrong way, where instead what we might see from Congress or just leaders in general is, I guess, adding more money to DHS and to, militarizing our police and occupying our neighborhoods as opposed to, or, as a response, and then, more marginally affecting, again, the same communities that are already marginalized, and they're already being silenced, they're already being targeted. When we think about school shootings and such, and the response to that, we know that it wasn't the white schools that ended up being essentially locked down with police officers in the schools and so on, in response to what was going on with that issue. And I see that happening again, with where the funding is going to go, what agencies are going to get more power, more militarized force, and I just, that's one of the fears that I have in how our leadership is going to respond to this type of activity.
Yeah, thank you, Alejandro. Daniel and Lexi, do we have 2 minutes each to give us some of your reflections and some of your local groundwork that you have seen?
Yeah, I think just to kind of tap in on what you all were saying about the six, I think a number of things kind of unfolded there, and even just thinking about the usage of wording too. We talked about the connotation of wraparound terrorism, whether it's domestic or foreign, it's terrorism, and so we really have to play the game of the individuals who have run this country for the longest, which are conservatives. These people, deem themselves to be contextualists. They deem themselves to be, patriotic as well for some reason. But in them calling out them being conservative and being contextualists, or people that believe words mean words, then you have to hold them to the oath that they take. And in the oath that they take, they take an oath to defend our country against foreign and domestic violence, and so, or domestic terrorism rather. But some of the work, here in Georgia that we have been working on, we had a bad experience in our gubernatorial race for Stacey Abrams, and it was really an ode to her in the way that we were liberated to come together. We were met here. We're in the South, where people assume that Georgia is a black state, but we're really in the city of Atlanta and proper Atlanta. It also has its places that aren't necessarily black or of color, and so we're really a brown place in the South in the sea of a red city or a red state. And so once we experienced what we did with the gubernatorial race, there was a number of strategies that were set in place by Stacey Abrams and three organizations that she coined, two of which were New Georgia Project and Fair Fight. And so, with their help, I was able to also mobilize 18 to 29-year-olds, pairing them with some of the resources that those organizations put out, like drop boxes. They were, in prior years, we never had a full or comprehensive database of drop boxes. We really brought this race home with absentee voting to the point that they're now trying to regulate how much we can vote from home. So in the presidential race, we really came out with early voting and absentee voting, and a lot of the tools that they set in place supported that. But then when we came around to the Senate race, people that had not voted in the presidential race voted this time around, and they voted early. And so we had maybe in the presidential race, we may have maybe 600 and something thousand, or maybe just at 1 million people voting at home. But in the Senate race, we had maybe 2 million people vote early in the race. So the energy really carried over from the presidential race. The significance of what was going on was national, even though it was a local race. And so the work for us was really highlighting where to go, when to go, giving proper information about candidates so that individuals were able to make choices. Because the want and the desire for a route was already there. I was able to speak with Aretha Martin, and even then I mentioned that this wasn't a choice for us. I don't think for any young person in America, but this in the presidential race, it wasn't a choice for us between two of lesser evils. It was literally that we wanted a route, and the Biden and Harris administration represented that route. I am a little bit young to really know much of the history of Biden as a politician or Kamala as a politician, and I'll do my research. But I do know that they represent a route. And so I feel elated that we were able to win the presidency, and I'm absolutely elated that we were able to flip this in.
Yes, and for those of you who might not know on this call, Daniel Rosebud, along with Shanice Turner, I hope she's on this call, and OYU and Georgia Youth Poll Workers, they did a phenomenal job. And Time came out with an article on how youth really organize and turn Georgia blue. So y'all have to check that out. There's a lot of mad respect for the groundwork that was laid out, like you said, Daniel, and the coalition building that was done in the midst of all this pandemic and trying to energize young people to get out and vote, right? So I do want to give Lexi time here to comment briefly on the amazing work of organizing on a reservation and how different that looks to secure and make sure that the Native youth have access to health, mental health, and a lot of the great work that she's also done in the Hopi Reservation.
Everyone's comments are really I guess interesting and eye-opening. Like Marlene mentioned, I do live on the reservation. I grew up here and have lived here most of my life. And just some terminology. I would hope everyone knows what a reservation is. But my reservation is fairly secluded. The nearest Walmart grocery store, like big grocery store, is about an hour away. The nearest town with about like a mall, a Target, Sam's Club, is about 2 hours away. And so understanding that. When the pandemic hit, our people weren't really sure what to do. A lot of reservations enforced curfews, a lot of reservations enforced no off reservation traveling. And because we didn't know what to do, we kicked into high gear getting food and supplies to our people, making sure that they were taken care of in that sense. But also realizing that doing those distributions, whether it's bi-monthly, whether it's every other week, however many times it took to get these supplies and resources out, was a form of, I guess, mental health work. With the current administration being my color or any person of color going into a border town, a town referring to a town that borders a reservation, are usually heavily very racist and will most times, if not all the time, refuse services to people who look like me. And in doing that, a lot of our people couldn't get into the towns or didn't want to go to town anymore to get the groceries or get the basic supplies that we needed, because a lot of the times we were harassed, we were turned away from services, or we just straight up felt unsafe. We didn't want to go in, or it was much more, I think, addressing the fact that it was much more than just a presidency. It was a movement in the wrong direction. It gave the opportunity, opened the door for people to express freely that I feel that I'm better than you and you're less than me, and I could care less what happens to you because of the color of your skin. And in realizing that, we noticed that the levels of stress were rising. We were getting a lot of calls into support groups. Because of the pandemic, we all had to go virtual or over the phone. We had to see spots with our local mental health folks over the phone, and they couldn't make their in-person visits per usual. And so we really had to navigate, how do we navigate this now new norm of not being able to see one another, of not being able to offer support like we normally do. If someone called me up and said, hey, I need this, or I'm not feeling too great, okay, come over, let's have some tea, let's get our minds right, let's talk about what's going on. And we can no longer do that. And so it really, I guess, threw a lot of our Indigenous communities into a frenzy. How do we navigate this? So realizing that, okay, the easiest way to get our people safe is to get supplies here and then distribute them ourselves. And even asking while they're in the distribution line, okay, how many households, how many kids, how many adults, things like that. And then asking, how are you doing today? Are you okay? Is there anything else? And then having to slip in because mental health is such a taboo subject. I'm trained in this. I'm trained in safe talk. I'm trained in assist. I'm able to talk to you without fear of being talked about. So just let me know if you're okay. And having to slide that in, because it was so foreign to a lot of people to be like, I don't want to reach out. We saw a rise in people creating opportunities for people to get on virtually and talk to one another, and wanting to say, I'm going to host a Zoom tonight. Get on, let's just talk about what's going on and let's make sure everyone feels okay. So the work is definitely different than working in the city, and we're so secluded, having to just in the city, you're working with people of many different backgrounds and many different situations, and a lot of times out here we're all facing the same thing, but it's times a couple thousand. And how do we navigate that? So
yeah, and honestly, the best way to wrap up, with the discussion that we just had, and thank you everyone for engaging in the chat, is really what Alejandro, Kim, Anushka, Daniel, and Lexi are talking about. What brings all of this together is really mutual aid. That on the ground, as community organizers, as leaders in their community, there was no response, and we knew no one was going to come and save us. So we organized, and through mutual aid, which is something that is really top of mind right now, that obviously because of the pandemic, a lot of people had to resort to help each other out as a community. Now, that is not a sustainable form moving forward, but it is beautiful to see that even in the midst of all this bipartisanship, constant extremism on all sides, people are still willing in their communities to say, how can we pitch in? How can we organize? How can we do some of this mutual aid so that our brother and sister is not completely off, fallen off? And, we are going to have a solutions-oriented conversation that has, more than just something like mutual aid, more concrete action steps that we can take.